All right, ladies and gents that are out there tuning in, we are back for part two. And good Lord Almighty, hell's bells, today almost didn't happen because basement flood and they found black mold in the basement. But our guests are gracious and going to support in the event that I have to run contractors downstairs and answer phone calls, which y'all will never know is happening because of the lovely editors. But we are back for part two of an episode that came out in February called the SLP Detective, Sensory Detective. And so we have none other than the lovely speech language pathologist, Jennifer Ruckner, and the lovely occupational therapist, Beth Cooper. And I have had the pleasure of knowing them and interacting with them through pulling this podcast together, but they were so gracious that they even tithed their time and came out to James Madison this past summer to work with mentoring our students as well as our surrounding colleagues in the area through a partnership for a grant that Dr. Aaron Kleinert and I were able to set up. So they definitely are givers and pour from very full cups, even if they're running ragged and it feels a little empty and may or may not be transitioning in and out of base housing. But ladies, thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks, Michelle. We're so happy to be back with you. It's so exciting to see you every time.
Yes, exciting is an understatement. Okay, so since we last recorded, y'all have moved places in the world and grown and have new faces. So give us fun, exciting life updates, please.
I'll start with Beth because she's had the biggest fun changes.
All right. As I said in part one, I'm a military spouse. So we just transitioned, although Tots to Teens, the company, Jen's company that I work for, is in Virginia. We were living in Illinois at the time, and now we've transitioned to San Antonio, Texas. We're at Lackland Air Force Base out there. So big, huge change, but did get to go back and visit Virginia and go to JMU this summer, which was such a blessing and so much fun sharing with the SLPs there and seeing that new horizon of getting all of this great information. And they were so excited to learn. So that was a real highlight this summer. But other than that, still the 4 kids are moving along, getting settled here in San Antonio for however long we're here. So that's my big life update. And then Tots had lots of changes too, which I'm sure Jen will get into.
Yes. So we've had several marriages, several moves for staff. We've had babies born. One of the things that Beth and I, we appreciate because we have a lot of young career women who work for us that have lots of life changes all the time. But what we really enjoy as we bring on new staff is the ability to be able to train them in areas just like this, the sensory side of things for SLPs, because we just don't get a lot of experience with that in school or any explanation of how that affects us as speech pathologists when we're working with our kiddos that have big sensory needs. So we not only do things like this, but we also do this every day within our clinics when we're working with our therapists to help them figure out what's the best way to utilize our methodology so that they can figure out how to best meet their sensory needs while also working on their speech skills.
Yes.
And, I almost forgot, Michelle. The biggest news of all is I'm about to be a grandma for the first time.
Oh my God. Are you serious?
I am. I'm going to have a little granddaughter. So I'm super excited. I almost forgot that. How did I forget that?
I was like, you took a real right turn, Jen.
Oh, wait. Do we have a name picked out? Like, is there like
Naomi is her name. So
I love that. Oh, well, bless it, Naomi. We are excited that you're percolating, friend.
that's right.
Yes, percolate as long as you can. But congratulations.
Thank you.
When everybody tells me they're pregnant, my first thought is this is the greatest news ever. And then I'm always the mom that's like, okay, so legit, the first several weeks are going to suck, but you're going to make it. because like everybody wants to be roses and rainbows. And I'm like, no, you're going to leak from things that you didn't know had the capacity to leak from. But if you make it to that 8th week, week number 9 is kind of sweet. It's like the turning point. Like, yeah. So if you're listening, there is your birth control for this hour. But okay. So also that does squirrel, big squirrel. I do want to connect y'all over to Dr. Lisa Bowers. She is the CAPSID, Council of Academic Programs for Communication Sciences and Disorders, Interprofessional Education Chair. And they're trying to do more talks on learning about IPE between different professions and how we instill that academically. So I would, if y'all are okay with that, I would love to make that segue because I think this is huge. And folks, if you're listening, this is how it works. We were not trained in sensory as speech pathologists. If you did, you probably got it within a clinical practicum rotation or maybe a one night in service within an ASD framework for a class. But we want to be the source of change. And so that's why the ladies are back. So if you haven't already heard it, please go back and listen to the first episode because the first episode really does set the foundation for the different domains of sensory. But we couldn't get into case studies and, as Beth and Jen said before we started recording, the meat and potatoes of it. And so I thought today we could flip it and say, what would it look like from the caregiver clinician perspective for a case study? That's a lot of C's, but help us understand painting a picture when a little one walks through the proverbial figurative door. Past medical history, what questions are you asking, and where do you go to make a profile to actually establish an intervention plan?
Yeah, great questions. And this is more than meat and the potatoes, what it looks like, what it's looking like from all sides.
Yeah.
When someone does come into our clinic, we really try to take that holistic view to begin with. The intake process is asking some really open ended and probing questions about all areas. We're trying to get an idea. And reality is, the intake forms don't get filled out well a lot of times. That's the truth. And I think we try to look at it from giving grace perspective is that the parents don't know. They know they want help, they know they need help, and they just don't even know what to put down. If you say, "What are your speech language concerns?" They
Yep.
don't know. They just want them to talk. If you're saying, "What are your sensory concerns?" They're not sure. So we prep our therapists then that they're not going to get a lot of intake information, but we do a lot of trainings with asking open-ended probing questions. So what does that look like? What mealtime? What does that look like for you? One of the favorite frameworks that I ever heard from a course was what breaks your heart and what breaks your back, from an OT perspective.
Oh, I love that
Right?
question.
So
What breaks your heart and what breaks your
what breaks
back?
your back? And so from a mobility standpoint, for OT, is it transferring from the bed? Like what's breaking your back? But then what's breaking your heart? What would make your life in 6 months? What would make the biggest difference in your life? And sometimes I would love to go through McDonald's and be able to hand a juice box back to them while we're going. A cup with a straw. I would love for them to be able to have a cup with a straw in the back of the car and be able to drink from it. That would make my life because we're running from place to place. So you're asking those more meaningful, open-ended questions, and that's during our intake process. And during that time, our therapists are always thinking, okay, so who else do we need to get involved in this team? What else? It's just that basic level, but we're also making sure that we're knowing that we're just seeing a snapshot of what's going on. So everything's not going to be found out in that evaluation. We're just getting a snapshot. We're not making, this is just the beginning. That evaluation is going on constantly at our clinic. We tell our therapists, you can always update a plan of care. You can always write an amendment to an evaluation. This is a constant learning process for you and the therapist.
Yes.
Go into.
I think too, when we're thinking about that intake process, we also have to look at, especially when we have a kiddo that comes in extremely active or dysregulated or something like that, parent has multiple times throughout their entire day that they're having those kind of behaviors, and not behaviors meaning negative, but there is something going on. Behavior is always a communication that something's not working. So
Yes.
trying to talk to them about that piece of it, like Beth was mentioning with the open-ended questions, this is not something that's just going to be during that intake process. That's going to be a continuous thing that we're doing with those parents. The key to sensory most of the time are the parents, because when we're looking at what's going on during the day, they're going to know things that have worked. And it would take us forever to, because like Beth said, it's just a snapshot. So
Yes.
we're not going to be able to get a full on view, and we're not going to get it in 30 minutes for speech. That's usually what our speech sessions are. So really depending and asking those questions to the parent and their expertise on their child is where we get a lot of the answers. And there's not a one size fits all for sensory. And every day could be something different that we're trying, because a child's needs vary from day to day. This is their nervous system and how it's receiving messages. So we've got to think of it in terms of that as
Yes.
well.
Yes. So the clinic that I work at now is the first clinic that I've worked at where I've transitioned to 30-minute sessions. And we can edit frequency and volume according to baseline needs. But if I had to do a 30-minute session as a novice clinician, I would have struggled personally with knowing what questions to ask, how to engage in caregiver coaching. And I remember when I left Francis Marion University and I went to work at Therapeutic Designs, I struggled with the pace of just transitioning to an hour-long session and having them back to back. And that was a stretch for me clinically, right? Because I was switching hat from professor mode to back in the clinic. But now I find that 30 minutes is typically the right volume of time for therapy for me to hone in on the one thing. What was that phrase? What breaks
What
your
breaks your
heart?
heart? What breaks your back? Mm-hmm.
Yes. And if I pull in the family guided routines based intervention approach that Dr. Francis Burns mentored me in, then I have, with those tools, with that framework of asking the questions, I'm able to pour into the caregiver, maybe do some direct intervention or direct modeling with the child, but pour into the caregiver in that 30 minutes so that they can carry it at home. And it's neat to see me doing it now, because hell, 5 years ago I would have struggled with it. But that's a skill that we have to learn how to juggle that. So what kind of questions are y'all asking to get into sensory for regulation or sensory for feeding? What examples could you give?
And I think it's really important as a therapist, for you to know your own sensory self. I think
Yes.
understanding your own sensory self is the start to being able to understand somebody else's. You have to know it on yourself before you can go to somebody
Yeah.
else's. Yes.
As I sit here with my hair ties and I'm stimming just off camera, hoping that not everybody can see me perpetually doing, yes, self-regulation.
It is self-regulation. And I sit here and fumble with my earrings or fumble with my ring, and I'm regulating myself. And I think that when we start to see ourselves as sensory beings and what are we seeking, how are we regulating ourselves, it's much easier to understand a child who has the younger you are, the wider you are in the sensory realm. You're a bigger sensory learner in a wider way as a child than as an adult. We narrow it down as an adult. And so understanding yourself, understanding others, and then you start asking those open-ended questions of when are you seeing this? Okay, and then what's the environment like there? What is, when you're saying they're not playing with toys, what does that look like? We do use teletherapy a lot to get those glimpses into the house for meal times and for play times. Is it visually distracting? Is there a lot going on? Are they more drawn to this or more drawn to that? And so you're asking those questions. You're not, what sensory needs do you have? It's, okay, when do you see that dysregulation? Is it when you put a lot of Cheerios out on the high chair tray, are they swiping it? That's when they start swiping trays. That's my first clue of we've got some visual overstimulation going. And then when you're putting one at a time, oh yeah, they'll eat fine when I do one at a time, when I'm pacing them. I think it's some visual overstimulation. And then you see them put the blocks out, swipe. Okay, so that gives me clues. I really do think of it like a detective. Like I'm hearing little pieces of information. I'm asking a lot of questions that the feedback I get from younger therapists is, I didn't know where you were going with that question asking. It seemed like you were just having a conversation about grandma moving in. And for me, I'm constantly taking that in and and what did that look like? Or how did they respond to that? And I'm asking, and sometimes it goes nowhere. Sometimes I'm just find out that grandma moved in and that was awesome. That's fantastic. And it didn't cause anything. But I feel like I'm constantly taking in information and seeing if that fits into a profile. Oh, have they had any great days when they came home from school? What did that look like? What happened? What was the timing? Did you go a different way home? What was their snack? Did they eat a different breakfast? My family hates it. They say that I ask 10 million questions about everything, but that's just my personality of we're going to ask all of these questions and put together what I can think. And sometimes, Michelle, I get off track. Like sometimes I am like, and I go down a lane that didn't work, and that's okay. And I give myself the grace to do that. Of that, sometimes I give suggestions or put something together that didn't work out, but I'll never stop. I'm just going to keep digging because it comes back to what we said in the first one, is that kids want to be successful. People want to be successful. And it's my job to keep digging and helping people brainstorm to figure out how we get there.
We have a little guy. He's not so little anymore. He's 6, and they just moved from out of state. And as Beth's talking, I was thinking he would be a good example for us to share, because mom indicated when she brought him in for the evaluation, this is not the kid that I've been raising. This is somebody I don't really know. As a mom, that's something that strikes to the core, because you as a mom know your kid better than anyone. And if she's saying, I don't know who this kid is, that's distressing. And she was clearly distressed herself about the situation. So there were many different things that came into play. When the family said that they were moving, his one-on-one aide said, oh, I'm not going to continue my job then, because the only reason I was staying was because of him. But she left 3 months prior to them moving. So there was one change. Then they moved. They ended up going across country and ended up staying in lots of hotels and whatnot on the way, and then moved in with grandma and grandpa, who they had not ever lived with before, until their house was ready. Then their house was ready, so then they move into the house, and then they decide to finish the basement. So that's all in upheaval when you're trying to do projects in the house. So it was one thing after another thing. So if you hear those situations, you're like, oh yes, it's 100% the move and all of these changes and all of that. But it's not always that simple. When our structure that we look at when we're looking at a kiddo is, we've got to look at it more globally than just what's in front of us. So some of the things that we look at, we start with, what's the concern? What is it that's concerning the parent? And then the next thing that we need to go to, so we can rule things out, is there a medical piece to this? So Beth's first instinct with this kiddo was like, has he been sick? Has there been anything going on with him? Because
he stopped eating completely.
Yep, he had stopped
He
eating.
stopped eating, and he showed some OCD behaviors, and then mom was saying, "This doesn't look like my kiddo." So for me, that kind of screams PANS or PANDAS. Do we have something going on there, autoimmune?
Pandas. Okay, dusting off the textbook knowledge here. Complications from strep throat that results
Mhm,
in like some pretty rare outlier extreme OCD
mhm.
tendencies. And what am I missing?
Yeah, an autoimmune reaction, and it basically OCD, it can impact feeding, handwriting, it's just more of a mental health exacerbation related to PANDAS would be a reaction to strep, and then PANS is a reaction to other illnesses. And it's pretty rare, but they're finding that it's actually happening more often than they believe it does. It's been really hard for the medical community to accept it as a diagnosis, but it is picking up steam now. I've had on my caseload 4 or 5 kiddos with it. So that doesn't seem very rare to
What,
me.
yeah, but what's the treatment for it?
There are antibiotics because what happens is sometimes they'll be then a carrier of strep and you don't even realize it. A lot of times they have to be very careful when they're at school about being exposed again because it can cause another exacerbation of it. And there's IV treatments, like infusion treatments that they use for
How
the
do they diagnose it?
there's blood tests. There's actual diagnostic blood test about it too. So for me, I just want to make sure just because I've had that come up before or
Mhm.
just is there an illness in some way? Do we need to look at allergies or swollen tonsils that are stopping? For me, it's always let's just get out of and my own kiddo had a laryngeal cleft that I would have never guessed in a million years that he had a laryngeal cleft that was causing him to be sick all of the time when he was little. I went and got recommended for a swallow study, and I was like, oh, this is ridiculous that I'm going in for this swallow study. And then I'm watching it, and he's penetrating with each swallow. And I was
Swallow.
like, I had no clue, no idea he was microaspirating all the time. The only comparison I had was that his twin was never sick, and he was always sick. And so he had 2 laryngeal cleft repairs, and so for me, I always go back to, let's
Yes.
rule all of these things out before we just say environmental. So we advised our therapist to ask some of those probing questions. Thinking back, has he been ill? But it wasn't. We ruled that part out.
Yes.
So
But
then you're
that's
back. Yeah, that's part of
but
it.
you do your due diligence,
Yes.
Right.
and the more that's why the more seasoned we get, ha 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 ha, you see all of these little outliers and you start seeing it's like the Matrix, man.
It
You see a
is.
pattern in the Matrix. Yes.
Yes. And
Yeah.
you're just going back to that, going back to what you know. And in that, probing those things, I know mom came back to the therapist and I've just never connected so quickly. I've never felt so seen, even though we went awry to back to medical and asked her to check out some things. But she's getting that, okay, they care. They're going to dig. They're being the ninjas that are going to find
Yes.
out what's going on here. But yeah, then we're back at square one. What's the environment? And what is he experiencing through all of this? Put ourselves in that position.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think that what Beth said is super critical. Just a parent feeling heard is so important during this process because really our little viewpoint that we have with our little snapshot is not anything compared to what those transitions or like in this kiddo's case, like he quit eating. Mom's worried because now he's not eating. And so really hearing the parent, but the other part of this is that this should be a team effort. There should
Yes.
be no one doing this alone because I can tell you, as a speech pathologist that's been working over 30 years, I still rely on Beth so much of the time to think of other things that I'm missing. Where am I missing? Because, being a supervisor of a lot of the younger therapists, I'm giving them pulling from my dregs of knowledge, but I need that OT piece too to help me think of things that maybe I'm not thinking of.
Yeah.
And then that combination of the whole team effort and collaborating on kiddos is where the success happens because that's when we're trying out all different kinds of things between what the parent has given us and what we've figured out, and then we combine them all together. I'm thinking about our other friend who was having some pretty significant transition issues between his OT session and his speech session. Beth, if you want to talk
Yeah.
about him.
Yeah, this is and with that kiddo, also we brought his OT and his speech therapist together, and Jen and I met with them and we brainstormed all of this. And we're guiding them, and we just re-meet and go through it again. I know that the OT was like, he really liked heavy work and throwing the ball. So then the speech therapist is like, all right, so we're going to bring in the ball. We're going to do some heavy work prior. But this other kiddo that Jen was talking about, OT and speech again, and they became to a roadblock because he had back-to-back sessions, which are sometimes really helpful for scheduling, but sometimes it's a really long time for a kiddo to be there for
Yes.
an hour of OT
Yes.
and then transition to 30 minutes of
Yes.
speech. It's a long. And so this was a kiddo I had seen via teletherapy for OT for 2 years about. So I knew the family well and had done a lot of coaching with them. OT was, oh, he's dysregulated. I don't know what's going on. And so dysregulation, when our level of activity doesn't match the task demands. So that's what we're talking about when we say dysregulated. So he's really dysregulated. He's 6 years old, and they were like, maybe we need a therapy break. And for me, I'm like, no, we're not going to do a therapy break. We're going to figure this out. Like, we've got this. He's 6, he's young, he's apraxic, he's autistic. Like, we are going to figure
Yes.
this out. Big meltdown city transitioning between OT and speech. We know that our waiting room can be loud, and he wears headphones, and he is super sensitive to noises. We know that profile from him, just from asking probing questions, figuring out that he needed the headphones. So we know that's an issue. So that was the initial thought process. So we decided as a team that we would transition we have a calm room that has like a tent and some lights and just quieter, so he doesn't have to go out to the waiting room. So he's going to go to the calm
Like a
room.
transition
Michelle
space.
thought I was brilliant. I was like, this is going to work. It was a disaster. It was absolute disaster. He was like, why am I going into another therapy room? That's not my therapy room. This is not calming to me. What we viewed as calming, not calming to
No.
him. We went back to the drawing board. We all met again. And speech was just like, by the time he gets to me and the device, he's telling me that he wants to go home, and I want to honor his voice that he wants to go home. And so we had that talk of, when he does say it, okay, we will go home, because I want his voice to be honored, because having a little piece of control, our sensory kids, life is so out of control for them that they don't know what's coming at them. To have a little bit of control helps them to regulate. Information is regulating, control is regulating. So I said, okay, so when he did say that, yes, let him go home, because he has been one to headbang and bust his head open as well. So we're going to honor what he says. We're going to honor his words. And Mom was very stressed out. She was like, aren't we reinforcing him going home? And I was like, no, we're reinforcing that we're listening to him.
Yes.
That we're listening to him, and his voice matters. So we're not falling into that we're reinforcing something, because if he could be here and he wanted to participate, he would be here. And we're not forcing him to participate in speech. So the next time we're like, but we're going to come up with a new plan. So information is regulating sensory wise. So we're going to have a visual schedule for him. We're going to give him the tasks that he wants to do. We're going to have some preferred items in there. What are his favorite things? He loves letters. He loves books. We're going to do preferred items, and we're going to line it out. And then when he is saying he wants to go home, we're going to show him where it is on the schedule to see that he has control, and there it is on the schedule. We'll see if that works. But also we know that it's a long time for him to be there from OT to speech. And I know that after school, Mom gives him popsicles too. And I was like, popsicles, number one, our mouth is our most organizing sensory part of our body. So when we are dysregulated, let's go for the mouth. Let's get a drink. Let's get a snack. So we're going to hit the mouth. We know popsicles are highly preferred. He has a very limited diet because of allergies. So we know Mom can make popsicles and bring in a set of popsicles that we can have in the clinic for him. and
Mhm.
it gives him a transition time, a highly preferred transition time. And also, cold wakes up the mouth, awesome for apraxia prior to speech, a great oral motor warm up. So I was like, let's try this. It worked fantastically. Just he transitioned from OT to our little kitchen area, had a popsicle with his sister. His sister is there as well. She's autistic as well. She had a popsicle with them for the social piece of it. And he transitioned right into speech. And he's been having amazing sessions since. So just regulating with the mouth, letting him have control. We're also giving him information, which of what his schedule is, what the timing is, because there's nothing that's harder for a kid. A psychologist that I worked with in a school system told me one of the hardest things for kids in general, but especially autistic kids, is not knowing how much work, and kids with ADHD, how much work and how much mental energy do I need to exert? So if they
Yes.
can know how much work they need to do, how much mental energy they need to exert, that's regulating. They'll have some sort of control. They know this is over, this has an end. And speech is hard. It is really hard to get to that top level of speech, and knowing you have to go in and exert that type of mental energy is really difficult, especially after an hour of OT. That's one
Well,
success story we've had sensory wise but the mouth is one, that mouth sense, that is one of the ones we go back to a lot, is let's hit the mouth for regulation.
Yeah.
one thing to remember, so the mouth is the most regulating place in our whole body. So that's the first important thing. The other important thing, though, to remember is when a child is dysregulated, our speech center is the first thing that shuts down. So trying to do speech therapy while someone is dysregulated is
Yes.
not going to work. That is why that piece is so critical. And the fact with this little guy that he was able to still communicate that he was ready to go was awesome. First of all, full on sentence that he wanted to go home. So that alone on his device that he could do that and think through that process was great. But as far as being able to divert from what the need that he had was, which was to get out of that situation, he just kept perseverating on that until we figured out what a good transition for him was. I think it's super important. We have a diagram that's a triangle, and on the triangle, the biggest part is our foundation. And guess what's on the foundation?
The
Self
regulation.
regulation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And trust is the other part of that. And if you don't have trust and safety, then we are not going to go anywhere else. And at the very tippy top of that triangle is speech and academic skills. And I cannot tell you how many people who have kids that have ADD, ADHD, whose parents have come, their parents will say to me, I can't get them to do any of their homework after school. They were at school all day long. They need to get some kind of regulation, heavy work or something. Like they need to play for a little bit to get some of those sensory needs met before their brain can go back into that academic mode to focus. And I
Yes.
think a lot of times, I wish I was telling somebody this the other day. My son has ADD, he's now 30. I wish I would have known all of this when he was in school. Like it would have been so nice as a mom with a kid that was struggling because he was a complete auditory kid. And what they wanted him to do was write down notes and take notes. He couldn't do those simultaneously and listen to the degree he needed to. But I didn't, a lot of the things that I know now, I would have pushed a lot differently. But we only can go forward with the knowledge that we have. So,
Yes. And give yourself grace for your former self. Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. So this transitions perfectly to a kid that I just put a pin in and discharged and I had the biggest heart to heart with the pediatrician. Bubby is 9 years old, and only diagnosis per se is ADD, ADHD, right? They were like, well, he's a really picky eater. whenever I get a referral for picky eating, I'm like, there's no such thing as picky eating. It's called PFD. But, digress. A very picky eater, right? Well, when I do feeding therapy, I'm only doing therapy if the caregiver is present and in the room, right? Because you break bread as a community. I don't take children away and magically address things and then drop them off with the caregiver. That's just how I practice. But what the caregiver, they had OT before me for 45 minutes. And then I would be there for the transition conversation because the caregiver did not engage in OT. And they would have the conversation about how we were doing with visual motor integration, handwriting, and those kind of things. And then we would transition into feeding therapy. But this kid, if I were to step back and look at the whole picture, we were failed before we began. And I expressed concerns over this because the child went to school for part of the day, got picked up to come to OT, to come to feeding therapy, missing school lunch on the day that he has feeding therapy because it's with me, to then go back to school to do therapy for school for a couple more hours. The only services available in the school were counseling, didn't qualify for anything else. And I start probing mom the questions when we're in there in our sessions, and it turns out he is struggling academically. And what I found was the more we were struggling academically, the more severe our eating habits became at home, to the point that we were stealing food and hiding it in between our mattresses, hiding it underneath the bed. And I put a pin in therapy and said, this is not me. This child does not need me. Anytime a new food was discussed, we would start gagging at the table, just talking about it. If mom talked about what she made for dinner the night before for siblings, we would even gag. And I asked the hard question of the caregiver, does anxiety run in the family? Do we have learning disabilities that run in the family? And it was yes, yes, and yes. And I'm asking the conversations around a child who is hyper aware of the conversation that's going on. So you have to be very careful not to cause harm or trauma in the pursuit of understanding your full picture, But it was a great conversation with the pediatrician of, we don't need me. What we need is to get into counseling, probably go for an RFID diagnosis, because I'm seeing picky eating and controlling behaviors, but it's a coping mechanism for the anxiety. I suspect we have anxiety at baseline, but it's getting exacerbated by a learning disability that is just now showing up in 3rd grade. And folks, if you're listening, there is a direct correlation between a speech sound disorder and dyslexia and literacy difficulties later on. Dr. Kelly Farquharson out of University of Central Florida, I think she said Central Florida, it might be Southern Florida. She's world-renowned and published tons of resources on how to do the diagnostics for this, like all the ins and outs and like treatment protocols. But that's what I saw happening. And this is not the thing that I treat. But because I've had her mentor me, I could see this piece. And so I discharged, and mom told me that sure enough, they got IEP, and all of this was going on concurrent to getting into counseling. I was like, I am here and ready in the wings. When all of this gets set for success and you're on the other side, come back to me, and there's a place and time for feeding therapy. But right now, we need anxiety addressed. We need learning disability fully understood, identified, and supported, and then come back to, and yes, he's still getting OT because we need self-regulation for this. But me, I'm so far down the pipeline, and that's okay. But giving ourselves grace to say it's not the time and the place, and I need to gracefully bow out, I don't think I was ever taught that in school. It had to be taught on the job, right?
Yeah, I totally we've had almost these exact situations come up in the last year, Michelle. Like, almost could have been the same thing where we're just, this is RFID, and that maybe in the future there are these other things that we can do, but it's all about knowing we can't do it all and we need a huge team, and
Yes.
figuring out what is most important, what's salient, what's most important right now for that kiddo, and lacking ego in that of I might not be the most important thing for them right now. And we've had to have kiddos, we've discharged kiddos also because pulling them out of school just wasn't the best thing for them
Yes.
at that time. And when you're talking about that, or you know what, that this is stopping them from OT wise, this is stopping them from doing swimming and gymnastics, which are amazing sensory experiences. I've told parents, I would rather you go to gymnastics and swimming that are sensory based in natural environments. And we can talk about OT later, like if it comes up again. But those things of knowing, looking at really a child's quality of life and what's most important, and not therapizing them as well. That you don't, because you might have a medical necessity for therapy at that moment, that might not be the most important use of your time at that time. Sometimes you just need to be, we've had kiddos that were like, they just need to be a kid this summer. They just need to be a kid and go to the swimming pool and be a kid for a bit. And so I love that holistic discussion of, and that we've talked at also about burst therapy. Of you can always come back when there's a need and we can do another stint when it's the time and the place. I love that time and place
Yes.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing for us to think about. It may be medically necessary for them to, they may still require speech, but there may not be that specific time that they need speech. I was thinking while you guys were talking about another kiddo that we've had where definite ADHD signals were that we really felt like that was where it was. And having to have those conversations with families about we've reached, like our OTs, we've reached where we can go with OT until we get that brain regulated so that the brain can work the way it needs to, meaning maybe medication, things like that. But until that happens, we've reached our ceiling. But then after that, let's see what's happening. And then we can delve back into it if we need to. So we've had those conversations as well from an OT standpoint with some of our OTs. But speech, of course, with feeding and things like that, if it's R fed, we need that psychological piece to come into it.
Yes. Yes. I have one little one on my caseload who has a genetic condition, and their genetic condition changes how they metabolize food, right? And I can introduce, genetic condition also leads to a diagnosis of ASD, right? So is it the genetic condition causing the ASD and causing the metabolism issues and a whole host of other things? So this child's profile, we need, for lack of a better phrase, as little as the child consumes, we need as much calorie condensed as we can get. So he gets away with eating all the things I will not buy for my own children because, like, we need it in his little body, right? But it's such small volumes at a time. And that has to do with his body just can't handle metabolizing larger volumes right now. Well, one of the treatments for this condition is appetite stimulants and more medical management. However, families' faith, they don't want to engage with and that is okay because we're healthy, we're stable. So it puts me in a position in the middle where, I talk to them. These are some of your options to increase the volume if you want to limit some of the grazing and do more of a structured mealtime routine. However, that's not me. That is your medical team has to manage that. We have to pull in the PCP. We have to pull in GI. We have to engage with them in order to go that route if you so choose. My offering here is making unknown foods safer just from like an exploration perspective while busting out my trusty AAC device so that we can understand the feelings around food. Oh my gosh, we had like a freaking breakthrough and he was like, I'm afraid. And it was, what was it that he was afraid of? It was a new package It was the packaging was different. The packaging had changed, right? But like we said, I'm afraid. Now, the amount of work that had gotten up to that point, and we had our monsters feeling book, and it was like the monster was afraid. And then I, programmed the device like the monster's afraid. But like he communicated that. That gave me the insight. But again, I can only go so far. And I have, as my mom would say, I have educated the caregivers accordingly, right? Like this is where my tiptoeing into the medical domain of the pediatric feeding disorder stops, because that is all physician specialist run. But it's another little guy that has back to back. He goes to OT before me. And in this case, that works out really well for him because he's hungry when he's done with OT, and then he comes to me and he's hungry. But, that's hit or miss. That might not be the right itinerary for everyone, but somehow this conversation turned into a discharge planning conversation. But it's perfect because like you have your case and I'm like, this is as far as I can take you, but then I have to like discharge because Shell can't do these other things. But I don't know. Sometimes I think my job is to put myself out of a job, like with the family.
It is. It is. And
Right?
I feel like that with parent education, I always say that to
Yes.
parents too, is that my ultimate goal is for you to not need me anymore. I'm educating you about these sensory systems. I'm educating you about self-regulation. And
Yes.
at some point, there's only so much education we can give. At some point, I'm saying, you know what? We're sitting here brainstorming, but you're giving me the ideas. You're
Yes.
telling me and we've transitioned that way. And then we're like, okay, I don't think you need me right now. And if you need me in the future, if something comes up, I'll be here. But that's the ultimate, is when they don't need you anymore. I
Yes.
remember somebody saying that they could always tell who a Tots to Teens client was because of the way that they presented what was going on, that you could say they were well educated. And that's the
Yes.
parent coaching, is that that's never, okay, we're going to go do therapy in a room and then bring you back and tell you what we did. It is they're in there. And during that conversation, and when I'm asking about grandma, I'm also educating them just like we did the JMU students. I'm educating our parents in that way. Okay, I see him jumping, and then we did the trampoline, and then we pushed the ball through the tunnel. And look now at how he is sitting and looking at this book. Look how
Yes.
regulated. He knows where his body is in space. And I'm telling them those things. So then I'm like, okay, I'm just narrating what I'm seeing, what my mind is thinking, and I'm just saying it out loud. Okay, we just swang and now we're wild and we're not coming back. So let's go. Let's try. I know that deep pressure is regulating. Let's try. Why don't we get their shoes and socks off? I'm going to have you massage their feet, and we're going to see if we can re-regulate to get back down. So that's the constant conversations we're having, is those conversations that we're having, that we're saying we're brainstorming with our teams, is that we're brainstorming with the adults too, with the adults in the room, whoever it is, whatever therapist is there with them, whatever caregiver, grandma, whoever it is, we're having those conversations.
I start giggling when you said take off their socks and shoes. I
It's my
sensory
go-to.
overload, dude.
Oh,
You give me a kid and they take their shoes off, and like I can handle the nastiest smells coming out of a kitchen, but some kids taking their shoes off and I am like outdone, cannot do it. And that is me doing it dysregulates me as a person, but I know that smell is going to dysregulate
yeah.
me. So if I know that I'm going into certain rooms where we have rules, you have to take your shoes off to get on the equipment, like I'm going to put on hand sanitizer right before I go in, and I'll go like this, and somebody will think I'm wiping my nose, but no,
A little hand sanitizer, a safe
sanitizing
smell.
this because that I know what's about. Okay, but that leads me to the next question of, what about when you're doing your sessions and the caregivers in the room, but the dyad between the caregiver and the child, and the caregiver's dysregulated, or the care, like I
Yes.
see, like, yes, huh?
Yeah. So we always say, especially when kids are younger, it is
Mhm.
a co-regulation,
Yes,
because if you think about a baby, the way a baby calms is by its mom rocking it, a mom loving on it, mom feeding it. Those are the ways that a baby calms. So co-regulation is 100% as baby. As they get older, all the way through like late elementary into middle school, there's still a lot of co-regulation happening, but it's getting where less co-regulation, then they're able to have some techniques that they can self-regulate. And then as you get to be an adult, you're not ever without a co-regulator. My husband is my co-regulator. Beth is my co-regulator. You have people in your life who are your co-regulators when you feel like you're getting out of sorts, right? So that is the same as it is with kids. So if we see families where, and we have families who, I'll use one example that comes to mind immediately. We have a dad who comes in with his son who's 3. They were coming in for feeding and language, and dad has a lot of the same sensory issues that, in my opinion, may have contributed a little bit to some of the son's sensory issues. But the little boy does have his own set, of course, of sensory issues. But dad, he would get something on his face when we were doing feeding, and dad's jumping up immediately, making these big productions about, oh, we got to get that off. He's going to get upset. And dad's freaking out over it. And so we had
freaks out.
Yeah. So we actually had to go, and before we even worry about the little boy, we have to help dad figure out, hey, listen, do you see when I'm super calm and I'm quiet and I use my soft voice, you see how he's not getting upset? So let's try it. Let's just see if it works. And so then we do it again. And dad sits there, and you can tell he's about to just jump out of that chair. He wants to wipe his face so badly, but he doesn't. The child does not any reaction. And dad realizes that by him being the co-regulating himself, he was able to keep the child also regulated. And so it has taken us months and months of working with this dad to get him to that, because it's instinctive, because it's a sensory thing for dad to have mess. He does not like mess of any sort. And teaching him about messy play and why that, hey, look at all the benefits from this. Teaching him that by him swiping his face every time that he gets something on it while he's eating is actually more dysregulating than to leave it until we're finished eating. Things like that. So really it's educating the family when they are having that it's their job, that in the child's storm, when they're having a storm, they need to remain calm so that child can also get to that calm level. And that's good for us as therapists to remember too, because inside, sometimes we freak out. And sometimes outwardly we freak out. So we need to think about that as therapists as well.
And that transitions well. We've had a lot of conversations lately too about our therapist dysregulation. And Michelle, not just with smells, but just having their bodies be used for sensory input all the time, and how they're just tired halfway through the day. Their bodies are tired of being touched. They feel dysregulated. They're frustrated. Yeah, overtouched. And so we've had a lot of discussions about that in the workplace of, okay, so we got Yogi Bo has these awesome bean bags, and they're very squishy. And so we got that for one clinic.
What are they called?
Yogi Bo, Yogibo, I believe. They're awesome, squishy bean bags that the kids can actually like get into and squish. So we're creating other opportunities for kiddos to get, they're awesome, crash and bang and squeeze, so that it's not our therapist bodies. So then we're looking at how do we stop it from being our therapist providing it, but also we had kids get older and it's not super appropriate to be getting squeezes and touched with their therapist. And so we're looking at how do we create these patterns in an area where our therapists are okay too, because we're sensory beings. And I love those honest conversations too, of the smells or the lights or the how to get pressure without it being your body.
Yes. I walked into the mess hall, and the mess hall in our clinic is right across from the jungle, and it's made to actually look like a birch tree jungle. And all I saw was Anna, one of the OTs that I work with, who's spectacular, laying on a giant beanbag, face down like a starfish, and there was two shoes sticking out the bottom. And at first, I didn't realize the shoes were attached to a human, and I was like, so I started chuckling, and I was like, Anna, honey, you doing okay? Because she was like face down and just like super still and quiet. And I was like, she's regulating. Like she must have had a hard session. So I keep tea in the office, and I'm thinking, you want me to go make you a cup of tea, like hot cocoa? Like, what do you need? Mom mode, obviously. And she looks over her shoulder and she goes, oh, no, he just needed a little deep pressure. But that's when I realized there was a body under there. But like, it was just shoes sticking out. But also, as a clinician, knowing I can't watch the kids do the rock wall, it makes me too nervous because of the trauma of Goose having concussions years ago. So, like when I see the kids climbing the rock wall and crashing, if that's what they need to regulate, I will tell the caregivers, you've been trained by your OTs. I am standing here, but you are the adult and you are responsible. I'm going to type up the note of what we just talked about, but I have to physically turn. I can't see it. It makes it's triggering for me. But if this is what they need, I will support it, just not visually watching, thinking somebody's going to get like decapitated in the process. Or I know that they won't, but like,
Yeah, and I think it's those conversations. That's what I love hearing around the clinic is the therapist talking about their own regulation, their own sensory needs, because then I know they're thinking about the kids too and the parents, right?
yes.
So it's meeting all of those learning styles.
I was thinking, I wanted to share with you and everybody that's listening. So Beth and I say that there's 3 powerhouses when it comes to sensory. And a lot of people are already doing one of them. It's tactile because sensory bends are everywhere. We're doing a lot of tactile play, things like that. And then it's vestibular and proprioceptive. So that is where that we've been talking a lot about heavy work. That's where that heavy work piece comes in. We do a lot with jumping on trampolines, that up and down position. This I'm going to let Beth explain in a second why we have to be super cautious, though, when we're swinging, that it's important to go that front and back. The spinning is it. There's caution. So I'm going to let Beth tell that in a second. But there's also it's really important in speech. We can do so many of these things. And one of the very exciting, we have a new CF, and it's always fun to have CFs because they're like sponges. They want to learn, but they're afraid sometimes to try something outside of the norm of what they learned in the university. And we're just not your typical. I crawl through tunnels. I do the whole thing with the kids. There is no being an adult when I'm in therapy. That's just not a reality because if I can't have fun, that kid's not having fun.
Yes.
So one of the things that was really exciting, because we see our OTs in the gym. We've got several gyms in our different locations, and we see them in the gym, but we don't see our speech in there as often. This is the best thing for our speech to do. Movement and that proprioceptive piece is like the best thing for us to be doing because that movement gets that whole speech production going. When you're regulated, we have seen just kids that weren't even trying to say words. And all of a sudden we get them moving and all of a sudden they're saying words. But going back to the CF, she did it. She went to the gym. She listened to what Beth and I were saying and she took her kid to the gym. She came out after that session and she was like, oh my gosh, he was doing all these things and saying all this stuff. And we're like, yes, it took one time of her seeing success with it. And now I see her in the gym all the time. Yes. So it's just very important. That is a critical piece to speech. And we've gotten complaints from parents who have not been educated. We like to educate our parents for a reason of why are you just playing with the kids?
Yes.
We're never just playing with the kids. Never. There's always a purpose behind what we do. And what the play, the movement, all of that has a purpose for learning. Beth,
Yes.
tell them about spinning because that is a common issue.
Yeah, people love to spin kids. I have a lot of vestibular issues, so I get super nauseous. Even turning back in the car to give my kids snacks and turning around will make me nauseous. I'm super careful with spinning, but actually, like, just knowing vestibular input. So we're talking about that inner ear, right? And those are linked to the speech centers of the brain because we're talking inner ear, vestibular. That's why it spurs so much language. There's been some really nice mashups between OT and speech research about vestibular input and speech. So in AOTA and ASHA, there's been really great research to support it. The powerhouse of vestibular is that 15 minutes of input can last 6 to 8 hours of impact. So that's huge.
Let me process.
Yes.
15 minutes of input.
15 minutes of vestibular input. So 15 minutes of movement. Movement input can last and make an impact to the brain chemicals in your brain for 6 to 8 hours. Those chemicals can still be found at a different level than prior to the vestibular input, 6 to 8 hours after, both positive and negative. So positively can lead to regulation, learning. That's why it's so important. I'm a huge advocate for schools not taking out their swings from playgrounds. Swings are really important for learning. Recess, just in general, rolling down a hill. Kids need that vestibular input. That is how parents will be like, they always need this. No, we move and swing and go as we're younger in order to mature our neurological system. So the more we give them now, the less they need it later. If you think about orphanages where kiddos don't get movement, what do they do when they're older? They rock. They're seeking that movement because they didn't get them input when they were younger. So we're going to give that sensory input at more intensity, frequency, or duration when they're younger to mature their brain and spinal cord and sensory systems so that we can move on from it. So that vestibular input, really important, regulating 15 minutes for 6 to 8 hours. Linear, so what Jen was saying, back and forth, is the most calming and regulating. So if you're in a linear fashion, super calming and regulating. The next would be like an orbital plane, like you're going around. That's a little more, get some pep in your step. Spinning is the most dysregulating. So there are kiddos that need it. I use it sparingly for kiddos that need specific vestibular work. The kiddos that don't have nystagmus, where their eyes move afterwards, where you're trying to elicit, they need a lot of intensity, but that's done in a controlled manner. But that dysregulation from a roller coaster or from spinning can have effects on behavior for 6 to 8 hours afterwards. So I like to stick to the calming stuff, especially when I've got a short amount of time, stick to that linear input. And I always follow it up with some heavy work or proprioceptive input, so that joint input. When you're activating those joints and the little proprioceptors in the joints, it's tricking your brain into sending calm down messages because your brain thinks that your joints are being kind of pulled out of socket. And so it tells your muscles to relax so that you're safer, so that you're not going to break something. So it's a little trick we use to kind of mess with the neurotransmitters to get your body to relax. So pushing, pulling are all those tricks. And really all the sensory things that we're using, the proprioceptive, the vestibular, are to balance brain chemicals. So we're talking serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. We're talking about those chemicals that are related to ADHD and autism and depression and anxiety. That's what we're doing sensory-wise. It's not some mumbo jumbo. We're using our bodies to regulate. If somebody is depressed, one of the best things we can do is have them go to the gym and do weights, right? To get that serotonin up. We're talking about that same thing. The heavy work is a playful way of us saying, let's get in a workout and get in some gym time, lifting some heavy balls or throwing some heavy balls or doing some animal crawls so that we can regulate our nervous system.
That my bear is my vestibular child because bed rest for 3 months of the pregnancy. Didn't get to know where
Didn't get a
his
lot of
body.
movement.
Yep, missed all of this because every time I stood up, he tried to pop out. So that was frowned upon.
Let's keep him in.
Yeah. But to this day, we walk every single morning. We do anywhere from 1.25 miles to 2.5 miles, give or take how much time we've allocated. Basically, how quickly Pack Dawson can get it together in the morning before we walk out the door. But it is distinct. We had a rain, like a couple of weeks of rain, and he came home and he was like, I'm just sad. All day today, I was sad. And it was because we had not gone walking. He had not gotten his vitamin D because of like the perpetual gray. And I was like, all right, we're just going to walk in the rain. So I busted out the umbrellas, and which is a sensory nightmare for Goose because now he is damp. Now his shoes are wet. So it's like, in order to fix one, I'm failing the other. And I'm like, Goose, my man, you're just going to have to suck it up, Buttercup. I love you, but I need you to take one for the team. But like after the third day of walking in the rain, he was like, I'm really enjoying this now. And I'm like, systematic desensitization, baby. But like, I can tell you at the end of the day, when I pick them up from school, or Goose rides the bus home now because cross country season's over, like it's palpable, the energy within our own home, whether or not we have co-regulated in the morning. And mommy's little ADHD self, if I have not gotten my miles in, or wear my beaded jewelry to stim with, bless them for taking all the edits out the entire time. But like, I can't sit still to do what I need to do. So I love you too. This is so much fun. Like,
So much fun.
yes. Okay. We have to come back and do a third. I'm just like, but it's always, there's so much. And wow, did we deviate from what we said we were going to talk about and went into like discharge? But like, this was great. Okay. If folks want to learn more from you, because I know that they will, where can they go to learn more? How can they reach out to you? If they're interested in potentially joining Tots to Teens Therapy in Northern Virginia, where do they look? Teach us the things.
All right. So you guys can find us. We actually don't put a whole lot of we do put content on our social media, but honestly, we celebrate our staff and our kids more than anything else. But you're welcome to join us on Instagram, which is Tots to Teens Therapy. Same for Facebook. Just search us for Tots to Teens Therapy. We can be found on our website, which is totstoteensTherapy.com. And if you would like to join us, there is a place that it says careers. You can go on there and fill out an application. It'll get in touch with us, and then we'll reach out to you. But if you want to get in touch with Beth or I for specific questions, you can reach me at Jen@totstoteensTherapy.com, or if you would like to reach out to Beth, it's Beth@totstoteensTherapy.com. And so those are always the best ways to reach out. We love what we do, and it's been awesome. It really has grown us to become mentors as we've kind of transitioned away from direct therapy, and we just love the team approach. So we're always happy to brainstorm all the time. That's what we love doing.
You weren't kidding when you say you celebrate your team, because there's like, I'm looking in here and it's all of these pictures of like wins of your peoples. And it's just, I love it. Okay. Most awesome. This. Ladies, thank y'all.
Thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome. Thank you so
Always a
much for
delight.
having us.
Yeah, dude, and nobody, like, my husband only texted a couple of things about like the basement situation, and so like we made it. Go team!
Go team.
We made it.
Folks, if you're listening, we love it when you message us on First Bite Podcast on Instagram. We love it when you give recommendations for potential topics or speakers. And if you haven't gotten your ticket yet, please follow up with Feeding Matters, because I know, because we're talking about feeding today in the framework of sensory, I know that the tickets are going fast for the conference the tail end of February. So there's that.